The sun rose over the naval training camp, and the sound of marching boots filled the air as a group of new recruits stood in line, their faces tense and unsure, but among them stood one woman a little shorter, a little slimmer, and very different from the rest. Her name was Lena, and she was the only woman in the entire group, and that alone made her the center of attention from the very first minute. Whispers ran through the line like a quiet storm. Some laughed under their breath, others shook their heads, and one even muttered she won't last a week, but Lena heard every word, and she said nothing. Her eyes stayed focused straight ahead, calm, but sharp, like she had already seen battles they couldn't even imagine. When Chief Dalton walked in, the ground seemed to shake under his boots. He was a tall, broad man with a voice like thunder and a face that looked carved out of stone. He had trained hundreds of men, but never a woman, and he didn't look happy about it. As he walked past Lena, he paused for a moment, looked her up and down, and then said in a low, rough voice, "You think this is a place for you?" The men snickered behind her, but Lena didn't blink. She simply said, "I'm here to train, sir," and Dalton gave a cold grin. "You'll wish you weren't by the end of the day." Training started before the sun had even climbed fully into the sky. The recruits ran laps around the field, lifted logs, crawled through mud, and shouted until their voices broke. Lena kept up at first, but the pace was brutal, and soon her arms shook, her legs burned, her lungs screamed, yet she refused to slow down. She had come here for a reason, and she wasn't leaving without proving herself. Everywhere around her, the men pushed past, throwing looks of annoyance and disbelief. They called her weak. They told her to go home. One even whispered, "Go back to the kitchen," as he ran by, but Lena didn't answer. She only clenched her jaw tighter and ran harder. Every step was a fight against the pain and against the voices that said she didn't belong. Chief Dalton watched her closely, his eyes narrowing. He was sure she would quit before the morning was over. He had seen tougher men break down in the first hour, but as time passed, he started to notice something strange. She didn't complain, she didn't cry, she didn't even look scared when he barked orders. She just nodded and obeyed with quiet focus, and that bothered him more than her weakness ever could. When the team reached the obstacle course, the men cheered, ready to show off. The field was filled with walls, ropes, mud, and water, the kind of test that separated the strong from the broken. Dalton blew his whistle and shouted, "Move," and everyone rushed forward, jumping, climbing, and diving into the challenges. Lena went last, taking a deep breath as she stared at the tall wooden wall in front of her. It was at least twice her height and slippery with mud. The others laughed as she struggled to get a grip. Her fingers slid, her feet slipped again and again, but she didn't stop. She tried a third time, a fourth time, her arms trembling, her breath heavy. But she refused to quit. Finally, she used a different angle, grabbed a crack in the wood, and pulled herself up inch by inch until she was over the top. The laughter stopped, and a few jaws dropped as she slid down the other side, covered in mud, but smiling quietly to herself. Dalton watched from across the field, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but inside he felt something shift. Maybe this girl had more inside her than he thought. When the obstacle course ended and the recruits lined up again, she was still standing, her body exhausted, her uniform dirty, but her eyes burning with something powerful, something no one could mock. Later that night, when the camp was quiet, Lena sat alone by her bunk, cleaning her scraped hands. A blister stung and her muscles ached, but she didn't care. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small old photo of her brother, smiling in his SEAL uniform. He had come through this same training a year ago, but he never made it to graduation. They said it was an accident, but Lena always believed there was more to the story, and that belief had brought her here. She whispered softly to the photo, "I'll finish what you started," then tucked it back into her pocket and lay down, trying to rest for the next brutal day. But she knew she couldn't sleep, not yet. Outside, the wind blew through the camp, carrying faint echoes of laughter from the others. But this time she didn't hear mockery, she heard challenge, and she accepted it silently. Somewhere in the dark, Chief Dalton was still awake, standing near his cabin window, watching the lights from the recruits' quarters. He thought about the way Lena had looked at him earlier, not with fear, not with pride, but with something deeper, quiet promise that she wouldn't break, and that thought stayed in his mind longer than he wanted to admit. The night grew colder, the camp grew quiet, and as the stars filled the sky, Lena finally closed her eyes, dreaming not of victory, but of the next sunrise, because tomorrow she would have to face them all again and prove that the girl they mocked was not there to survive, she was there to win. The morning horn echoed through the camp, and the air was cold enough to sting the skin, but no one dared to complain. The recruits lined up again, their bodies already tired from yesterday, but the day had only just begun. Lena stood at the end of the line, her hands wrapped in rough bandages, her face calm. Though her muscles ached like fire, she had slept only a few hours, but her spirit burned bright. She whispered to herself quietly, "One more day, one more fight." Chief Dalton walked out with his usual stone face, his boots crushing the dirt with each heavy step. His eyes scanned the group and stopped on Lena for a long second before he shouted, "Warm up." The sound was sharp enough to make even the strongest flinch. The men began running in circles, counting push-ups, shouting numbers, their voices echoing through the camp. Lena kept up her breathing, steady, her rhythm never breaking. As the drills grew harder, the mocking began again. Blake, the tallest recruit, smirked at her every chance. He called her slow and weak, said she should quit before she embarrassed herself again. Others laughed behind him, their voices low, but cruel. Lena heard every word, but her face didn't move. She had learned that silence hurt the more than shouting back ever could. Dalton saw it all but said nothing. His job was to break them, not to comfort them, and he believed only pain could build strength. He ordered the next challenge, water survival training. The word alone made everyone tense. The cold ocean waited just beyond the training field, and the waves crashed like thunder as they approached it. The water was dark and deep and filled with fear. Dalton barked out the rules: stay under until I say, or you fail. One by one, the recruits stepped forward, taking deep breaths before plunging into the freezing sea. Lena was last. She walked slowly, the icy wind biting her skin, but her eyes never left the horizon. Dalton looked at her and said, let's see what you've got. She nodded and jumped, and the cold hit her like knives slicing through her body. She wanted to scream, but instead she held her breath and sank deeper. The world went silent under the water. She could hear only her heartbeat, slow and steady. She thought of her brother. The story they told her, that he drowned during training. She didn't believe it. She believed someone let him down. And now she was here to find the truth. She stayed under longer than she thought she could. The pain grew stronger. Her lungs screamed for air. She saw Dalton's shadow above her, watching the seconds ticking in his head, waiting for her to give up. But Lena didn't. She kicked harder, rising fast, until she broke the surface, gasping for air, but smiling through shaking lips. She shouted loud enough for everyone to hear, that all you got. And even Dalton's stern face twitched as the others looked at her in disbelief. No one had expected that from her, especially not after the punishment of yesterday. When the group returned to shore, Dalton told them to drop and give 50 push-ups. While still dripping wet, the mud clung to their faces. Their arms trembled. The ground turned slippery. But Lena kept going until her arms gave out. She fell, but pushed back up again. Each breath a battle, each push a victory. The other recruits stared at her, slowly realizing she wasn't just stubborn. She was something else, something they couldn't break. That night the camp was quieter than usual. The men were too tired to talk, but Lena couldn't rest. Her hand shook as she cleaned her blisters, the skin torn and raw, but her eyes stayed bright. She looked at the photo of her brother again, whispering, I'm still here, I won't stop. She tucked it back under her pillow and stared at the ceiling, listening to the sound of rain tapping against the roof. Outside, Dalton sat under the shelter, smoking quietly, his eyes distant. He thought about her again, how she refused to quit even when he made the drills harder for her. He told himself it was just training, that he didn't care who broke first, but something about her fight reminded him of his younger days, before the uniform, before the medals. Maybe he saw a part of himself in her, the part that once believed pain had purpose. The next morning came before anyone was ready. Dalton gathered the recruits again. Today you will learn teamwork, he said with a harsh grin. He paired Lena with Blake on purpose, knowing the tension between them. They had to carry a heavy log through mud together for 1 full mile. Blake scowled at her. Don't slow me down, he said. And she just nodded. The whistle blew, and they began to log, heavy and rough against their shoulders, the mud deep and thick around their boots. Halfway through, Blake stumbled and blamed her, shouting loud enough for everyone to hear, this is your fault, you're too weak. Lena ignored him and adjusted her grip, using her legs to push through the sinking mud. She didn't argue, she didn't waste energy on anger, she just kept moving step by step. And soon Blake was the one panting and falling behind. When they reached the finish line, she dropped the log gently while he collapsed in the mud. The others laughed at him, not her. Dalton watched silently. There was something changing in the air, respect mixed with confusion. She had turned their mockery into motivation. He finally called out enough for today, but as everyone walked away, he stopped her and said quietly, you have more fight than sense. And she smiled faintly, maybe that's what it takes, sir. As the sun set over the camp, the wind carried the sound of waves. Again, Lena stood at the edge of the field, staring at the horizon, her body covered in bruises, her heart steady. She whispered to the wind, tomorrow I'll be stronger, because quitting isn't in my blood. And somewhere behind her, Chief Dalton watched with crossed arms, his face unreadable, but his thoughts clear. Maybe, just maybe, this recruit was going to change everything. The sun had barely risen when the sound of the whistle cut through the cold morning air, and the recruits came running from every corner of the camp, their boots pounding the dirt in rhythm with their heavy breathing. Chief Dalton stood toward the center of the field, his arms crossed, his face unreadable, his voice sharp, as he shouted, today we'll decide who belongs here and who goes home. His eyes stopped on Lena for a long second before he barked out the next words, obstacle course double. Time no. Excuses, no breaks. The recruits groaned under their breath. They knew this course was brutal: mud pits, high walls, barbed wire, rope climbs, water crossings, and a final sprint that broke even the strongest. Dalton had designed it to destroy confidence, and he wanted Lena to fail in front of everyone. She didn't know it, but this was his plan, to push her past a limit or make her quit. Lena lined up with the others, her breath fogging in the cool air, her body still sore from the last 2 days. She could feel Blake's glare beside her. He whispered quietly, this is where you fall, sweetheart. She didn't reply. She just stared ahead at the long stretch of mud and pain waiting for her. The whistle blew and chaos erupted. Boots splashed into puddles. Mud flew in every direction. Men shouted orders and curses as they scrambled forward like desperate animals trying to survive. Lena ran with them, her arms pumping, her heart pounding in her ears. She reached the first obstacle, a deep pit filled with freezing water. She jumped in without hesitation. The cold bit into her skin, but she kept moving, her fingers digging into the wet ground as she pulled herself out, gasping for air. The others were already climbing the wall ahead, tall, slick, and covered in grime. She sprinted toward it, her shoes slipping, her hands sliding on the wood, but she refused to slow down. She jumped, caught. the edge with her fingertips and pulled herself up with a burst of strength she didn't even know she had. From across the field, Dalton watched her silently. She shouldn't have made it this far, he thought. But there she was, covered in mud, but still climbing, still pushing every boundary. He said she fell once, twice, but each time she rose faster than before. The other recruits began noticing too. Their laughter turned into silence, their eyes following her as she fought through every obstacle like it was her last. By the halfway mark, Blake was ahead, smirking as he looked back, but Lena was gaining ground, her legs heavy, her lungs burning, but her will sharper than ever. She remembered her brother's voice echoing in her head. "You're stronger than they think," she whispered back to the wind. "Maybe I am." She reached the rope climb and grabbed it tightly. Her palms raw from training. The rope burned her skin as she pulled herself up higher and higher until she rang the bell at the top and slid down, landing softly in the mud, her arms trembling but her face glowing with fire. The recruits around her began to shout, some in disbelief, others in encouragement. She had turned their mockery into something else, something they couldn't understand. Dalton yelled, "Keep moving, don't slow down." And Lena did just that. She hit the water crawl, next pushing herself under barbed wire while cold, muddy water filled her clothes. She could hear shouting above her. "Move faster," they cried. But all she heard was the sound of her heartbeat, slow, strong, and unshakable. When she finally crawled out, she was shaking, her uniform heavy with water, but the finish line was in sight. She looked up, saw Blake ahead, stumbling and falling in the mud, his strength fading. She pushed harder, her legs burning like fire, and in that final moment she passed him, sprinting across the line before collapsing onto her knees, her chest heaving, her hair plastered to her face. The camp went quiet, all eyes on her. Dalton walked over slowly, his boots sinking into the mud, his expression impossible to read. The recruits waited for him to shout, to mock, to punish, but instead he just looked down at her for a long moment and said again, "Tomorrow," his voice calm, but different. Something had changed in it, a trace of respect, maybe even pride. Lena stood slowly, her entire body shaking from exhaustion, but her eyes alive. She met his gaze and gave a small nod. She didn't need praise, she didn't need applause. She only needed to know she had survived another day stronger than before. The others watched in silence, unsure what to say. Even Blake looked away, shame flickering across his face. That night the sky was clear for the first time since training began. The stars shone bright above the camp. Lena sat outside her cabin alone, her hands still bandaged, her mind replaying every second of the day. She felt the ache in her muscles, but beneath the pain was something new, a quiet confidence. She took out her brother's photo again, his smile steady, his eyes bright. She whispered softly, "You be proud of me today. I didn't stop, I didn't let them win." Inside his office, Dalton stared at the training logs, her name circled again and again. He had pushed her harder than anyone else, but she hadn't broken, and that unsettled him. He poured himself a cup of coffee, staring out the window of the dark field where she had run earlier. Maybe she was more than a recruit. Maybe she was proof that strength didn't always look the same. He didn't say it out loud, but a small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. The next morning would come soon, and he already had a new plan, another challenge even tougher. But as he looked at the stars, he knew one thing for sure: this girl wasn't going to quit, and that thought both worried him and made him strangely proud. Back in her cabin, Lena finally lay down, her heart steady, her mind calm. She didn't dream of rest, she dreamed of tomorrow, because every sunrise meant another chance to prove them wrong, and every bruise was another story waiting to be told. The night before the new challenge, the camp was quiet, but Lena could not sleep. Her body was tired, but her mind would not rest. She had made it through 3 brutal days and earned something rare in the camp, a quiet respect from the men and a silent nod from Chief Dalton. But she knew it would not last. Not everyone liked seeing her win. Not everyone wanted her to stay. When dawn broke and the whistle screamed across the base, Lena moved quickly, putting on her uniform and boots. But when she reached for them, her boots were filled with cold water, and mud. Her locker door was half open, her food tray missing. She looked around, slowly realizing someone had done this on purpose. A small smirk appeared on her face. She whispered, "Nice try," and poured the water out before marching to the field, her spirit unbroken. Blake stood nearby, pretending to stretch, but she saw the grin on his face, the one that told her everything. He was the one behind it. He hated that she kept outshining him, hated that Dalton had started to notice her strength, and the only way he knew to fight back was to make her suffer. She ignored him, but he wasn't done yet. Dalton gathered the recruits, his voice cutting through the cold air. "Today," he said, "you will fight in pairs, hand-to-hand combat, no mercy, no fear, only skill will keep you standing." The men cheered and laughed, slapping each other's backs. But when Dalton read the list, everyone went silent. He had paired Lena with Blake. The crowd murmured. Someone whistled low. This was not just training, this was personal. Lena and Blake stepped into the ring, the ground soft with dirt and the air filled with tension. Blake leaned close and whispered, "I'll make sure you regret staying here." She didn't answer. She only adjusted her stance, her eyes calm, her body steady. Dalton's voice boomed again, and Blake charged like a bull, his fist swinging wild with anger. But Lena moved fast, stepping aside, letting him waste his strength. The crowd shouted as he missed again and again. Dalton watched closely, his arms crossed, his expression cold, but his eyes focused on every move. Blake swung again, catching her shoulders. She stumbled back, the hit heavy enough to make her vision blur, but she didn't fall. She raised her hands again and stepped forward, her body small, but her movement sharp. She struck his side, then his arm, using his size against him. Blake grunted, angry now. He pushed forward, hitting her again, this time after the whistle. Dalton shouted enough, but Lena held up her hand, her voice firm. Let's keep going. The camp went silent. Even Dalton paused. She wiped the blood from her lip and raised her hands again. Blake hesitated and attacked with fury, but his anger made him sloppy, and this time Lena ducked low, her leg sweeping under him, sending him crashing to the dirt. The crowd gasped. Dalton's whistle blew, and his voice thundered, "That's it," but Lena had already stepped back, breathing hard, her eyes locked on Blake, who lay stunned in the dirt. Dalton's face was unreadable, but inside he felt something stir. She had taken a beating and turned it into a lesson, not with power but with control. The other recruits whispered, watching her walk away, no longer laughing, no longer mocking. They saw now that she belonged. Later that day, as the sun dipped low, Lena sat alone by the training field, cleaning her bruises. She could hear footsteps behind her. It was Blake, his voice quiet to them. "Before I went too far." He said she didn't look up. "She just said you did, but it's over now." He nodded awkwardly, then walked away, and she watched him go, her mind not on anger, but on something else. She knew someone had to hate her to fear her before they could respect her, and maybe that was what was happening now. Dalton called her to his office that evening, his voice calm but heavy with meaning. He said, "You could have reported him for hitting after the whistle. Why didn't you?" Lena looked at him and said, "Because I wanted to show him that strength doesn't come from size, it comes from purpose." Dalton studied her face for a long time, then nodded slowly, his voice softer than before. "Maybe you're right, maybe purpose is what keeps us alive out there." As she left his office, the camp lights flickered in the distance, the night wind carrying the sound of waves against the shore. Lena walked to the edge of the training field, the sky glowing orange and pink. She thought of her brother again. She remembered his laugh, his determination, and the mystery that still haunted her about his death. She whispered softly, "I'll find out what happened, I promise." That night, something strange happened. When the recruits gathered for dinner, they made space for her. No one mocked her, no one laughed. One of them even passed her a cup of water without a word. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a beginning of something close to respect, and in that moment Lena realized she was changing not just herself, but the way they saw what strength looked like. Meanwhile, in his office, Dalton wrote notes on the day's results. His pen paused over her name. He thought of her words about purpose, and how she never quit no matter what. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, the faintest smile on his lips. Maybe she's what this place needed, he muttered to himself before turning off the light. Outside, Lena looked up at the stars, her body aching, her spirit strong. Tomorrow, she knew there would be another challenge, another test, another fight. But she was ready for it, because every time they tried to break her, she only came back stronger, and somewhere deep down she could feel that her journey was far from over. The morning sky was gray and heavy, with clouds of wind colder than usual, as if the camp itself knew something big was about to happen. The recruits gathered on the field, rubbing their hands together, their breaths turning white in the air. Chief Dalton stood at the front, his expression hard, his voice echoing through the camp. "Today," he said, "we will test something different, not just strength, not just speed. Today, we test control, the kind of control that separates a soldier from a fighter and a fighter from a warrior." His eyes stopped on Lena, and a slow grin crossed his face. Lena felt her stomach twitch. She knew that look, it meant another test, but this time it felt personal. Dalton turned to the group and said, "One of you will face me in combat." Silence filled the field. No one dared to move, no one wanted to volunteer, but everyone knew what was coming. Dalton pointed directly at Lena and said, "You're up, soldier." A wave of murmurs spread across the recruits. Someone gasped, another whispered, "She's done for." Lena stepped forward, her face calm, though her heart beat so fast she could hear it in her ears. She nodded slowly and said, "Yes, sir." Dalton nodded back, motioning her toward the center of the ring. He removed his jacket, revealing a frame built by decades of combat muscle and discipline. She looked small compared to him, but her eyes didn't waver, not even once. Dalton's voice cut through the tension. "This is a demonstration, no weapons, no rules, just skill and instinct. Let's see what you've learned." The recruits circled around the ring, some cheering, some whispering, bets most certain that the fight would end in seconds. Lena stretched her arms, breathing deeply, reminding herself to stay calm, to remember every lesson, every pain, every moment that had brought her here. The whistle blew, and Dalton moved first, his speed shocking even the other trainees. He lunged low and fast, but Lena dodged just in time. The crowd gasped. He swung again, and she stepped back, the force of his movement kicking up dust between them. She could feel his power in every strike, his precision, his experience, but she also saw something else. He was testing her, not just attacking her, his eyes watching for weakness, for hesitation. She refused to show either. Dalton circled her like a wolf, his voice calm. "You're quick, I'll give you that, but quick doesn't win. Fight strength." Does. Lena smiled faintly, maybe she whispered, "But timing does too." He charged again, faster this time, his arm catching her side. She stumbled back with pain flashing through her ribs, but she recovered, spinning low and landing a kick against his leg. It barely moved him, but it made him pause, and that tiny pause gave her hope. The recruits shouted, some calling her name, others warning her to give up, but she didn't hear them. She heard only her brother's voice whispering from memory, "Never back down." She stepped in close, trying to read Dalton's next move. He faked left, then grabbed her wrist, twisting hard. She felt her balance slip, but instead of resisting, she let the motion carry her. She turned with his force, bent her knees, shifted her weight, and in one smooth movement used his strength against him. The next second, Dalton's feet left the ground, and he landed flat on his back in the dirt. For a moment, no one breathed. The field froze, the sound of the wind, the rustle of flags, the pounding of hearts, all mixed into silence. Dalton blinked up at the sky, then looked at her, his expression unreadable. The recruits stared in disbelief, some with open mouths, others cheering loud enough to shake the air. Lena stepped back, her chest rising and falling, her face covered in sweat, her hands trembling slightly, but her eyes burning bright. Dalton got to his feet, slowly brushing off the dust. He looked at her for a long time, then nodded once, his voice steady. Good technique, soldier. You used my weight against me. Lena nodded back, catching her breath. You taught me to never fight power with power, she said, to use control instead. Dalton almost smiled, a rare thing for him. Maybe I did, he muttered, turning to face the recruits. He shouted loud enough for everyone to hear. This is what strength looks like. Not size, not gender, not muscle, but heart and control. The recruit stood in silence. No laughter, no whispers, just respect. Lena lowered her head humbly, though inside her heart felt like it was on fire. She had done the impossible. She had flipped the toughest instructor in the camp and earned his respect in front of everyone. After training, the recruits gathered around her for the first time, asking questions, sharing smiles, some even apologizing for their earlier mockery. She answered them kindly, not with pride, but with calm humility. She knew the battle was not against them, it was against herself, and she had won it for today. Dalton watched from a distance, his arms crossed, his expression softer than usual. He thought about how far she had come, how many times he had pushed her hoping she would quit, but she never did. He saw now that she wasn't there to prove anyone wrong. She was there to honor someone, to fulfill a promise that went beyond the camp, beyond training. That night, Lena sat alone by the sea, her uniform still damp from the fight. The waves crashed gently under the moonlight. She took out her brother's photo again, the corners worn from being held so often. She whispered, I did it. I flipped him. You'd laugh if you saw it. She smiled softly, then looked up at the stars, feeling the wind brush her hair. Tomorrow would bring new pain, new tests, new battles. But tonight she allowed herself to breathe, to feel proud for the first time since she arrived. Back at his office, Dalton stood by the window watching her in the distance. He said quietly to himself, she's not just a recruit, she's a fighter, and maybe the best one this camp has ever seen. The waves rolled on, the camp lights flickered, and Lena stayed there under the moon, knowing that her journey was far from over, but also knowing that she had finally become what she always wanted to be, not just a soldier, but a story worth remembering.